Today on the Roundhouse, we're learning more about the freight railroad industry from an analyst's perspective. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozerak, and this is episode number 152 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. The Roundhouse podcast is a Streamliner Media production. If you're needing help with regards to video content for your freight railroad, tourist railroad, or museum, I'd love to help you out, and you can learn more at streamlinermedia.com. Today, we are talking to Tony Hatch. He is a senior transportation analyst from ABH Consulting. What we're going to do today is look at North American freight railroading from a financial perspective. As a fan, it's very easy to forget that trains have existed to be of service to the economy. And so Tony's perspective on the recent mergers that have happened and where short lines fit into the picture of the 21st century landscape of railroading is really worth learning more about. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank those of you who are supporting the Roundhouse podcast on Patreon, folks like Atlas171 and Sean Biddle. For as little as $1 a month, you're going to be helping to produce the content that we are covering here on the podcast. And I thank those of you who are supporting very much. I also want to thank the sponsor for today's episode, Strasburg Railroad Mechanical Services. Learn more about how they can help you with your restoration projects at mechanical.strasburgrailroad.com. Our guest today is the Senior Transportation Analyst for ABH Consulting. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Tony Hatch.
Thank you.
Glad to have you on the show today, Tony. So, kind of breaking it down in layman's terms, what is a transportation analyst?
That's breaking it way down. I assume that your listeners will know what analysts are. They are the people in the financial community working with professional investors, that is not retail folks like you or I, who specialize in as industry experts in order to provide information that can ultimately lead to investing or not in stocks within an industry, but therefore also have a big role in helping mold, either by understanding trends in the industry or helping to try to, as I try to do, change trends within the industry. They are often quoted when you get earnings period, and we're recording this right at the beginning of the second quarter earnings reporting period. When these companies report, you'll see in the newspaper and on business newscasts and whatnot, analysts quoted as saying the earnings were good or the earnings were bad. People misunderstand that they think analysts really are stock pickers. We deal with professional investors, hedge funds, long only institutional funds, pension funds, endowments, etc. They do the stock picking. We provide the information on things such as, will railroads actually ever grow again is one of the big questions now, for example, or are they too focused on cost cutting? Those are the kinds of things that we answer. So those people here, analysts out there saying, well, he missed the earnings, he missed the call on picking Apple stock at the right time or something like that. That's not really what we do. That is a common misunderstanding.
Interesting. So how did you end up entering this field of work?
Like most people in life, kind of randomly. I went through a very famous training program in New York for now a firm that no longer exists called Solomon Brothers. And it was a great way to train to decide to do something within the financial industry. I'm from New York. The industry runs our town. Was always something that sort of interests me, being at sort of the seat of power, if you will. Solomon, however, was a very famous trading company, which in many ways is all part of the same chain of creating liquidity for a stock, even for big, 150 plus year old companies like Union Pacific. But that company's ethos was so old school trading, macho, that it was the first training program was written up in Liar's Poker, the famous book by Michael Lewis. It started his career. Well, I was in the second program, which meant that I didn't have the opportunity to read the book, or I might have done things differently, because I realized how careful contemplation, which is a large part of what analysts do, is not something that was valued by the firm I worked for. But I had a lot of fun, and they basically, at the time, the thing to do was to apprentice you as a young person with a senior analyst, with the idea that over time you would be given your own portfolio to follow in a related industry, possibly a different industry, or you would go to a different firm. Ultimately, I worked with a senior rail analyst. I had several choices of industry. One was chemicals, which I thought was, required really its own language, and that was actually always my worst skill at school. The other was wireless communication. I thought, well, there's no future in that, which shows you something about my future thinking. And the third was railroads. And I thought railroads. I was a history major at college. Railroads have a very proud and important history in not just the U.S. but in North America. And to understand railroads, you have to know at least a passing bit about all of the commodities they carry, which range from consumer goods to coal to chemicals to automobiles, agricultural products, etc. So I thought that was it would never be boring, because something would always be interesting within that portfolio, and that has actually proven to be the case. The really lucky thing was, when I started out, the railroads had just been deregulated in 1980 by the Carter administration. We need to remember, under the Staggers Act, and only a few years after that, when I sort of came onto the scene, they were still struggling with what that would mean. And ultimately, what that would mean was what I termed the railroad renaissance. So it was really a great entry point. Railroads were kind of flat on their back. They owned so many different companies that were not related or barely related to rail, that were part of the real estate portfolio. For example, they owned timber companies and gold companies. And they did all that because railroads were a rather lousy investment under regulation, without the ability to be flexible in pricing and whatnot. They were overstaffed, underinvested in, with terrible technology, and really seemingly an industry on the way out. And that has completely reversed itself. The first thing they did was sell off all of those non-rail assets and really become essentially pure rail plays, because they began to realize the future actually was in the ancient industry of freight railroading.
So you recognize that being in this line of work, you have an advantage because you have the historical understanding. What are some misconceptions that you think exist in the business world that you try to educate on when it comes to the nature of railroading?
Well, there's plenty. Railroads are a very old industry, and so less so now, because they had a terrific run beating the market most years of this century, for example. But for a long period of time, people basically ignored them or forgot about them. And if you live where the money is, meaning like in New York and Boston, where a lot of the professional investment money and stuff, you never see a trade. I mean, to many people, when I started, I said I was a railroad analyst, or transportation. I also cover intermodal the side of things. But when I would say railroads, they would think Amtrak, right? And Amtrak has always had a kind of spotty reputation. And so, first is to educate the general public that there is a freight rail system out there, and that it is vital to their daily life in terms of what they eat and purchase and drive, etc. And the lights that go on and all those things. The other misconception now for a more sophisticated investor is, but perhaps still not one fully thinking it through, is that railroads have had the rail renaissance, as I called it. That really went from the mid to late 90s to 2008, let's call it, maybe a little bit after the great financial recession. but that all that period is sort of behind us, and now they're kind of a stagnant industry. And many people that the only thing they can do is to continue to get more efficient rather than grow, and that's the big battle going on among the investors who understand the rail industry to some degree, understand and support it. So you have either there are trains out there. If you're in Chicago, you see them all the time. If you're in New York, there's a good chance you've never seen or noticed a freight train. You see the containers stacked up outside of Newark Airport for the Port of New York and New Jersey, but you don't necessarily think how they got there.
Interesting. So when it comes to the nature of looking at these trends, what are the types of things you're looking at? Because, I mean, I imagine that there's so many millions of variables. What are the things that you're keeping your eye on when it comes to trends?
Well, the key thing, I mean, there's in the short term, it's obviously the economy. This is a derived demand business. That is, railroads can recapture or lose share to trucks, which they, an ongoing battle since really the interstate highway uh, system was built in the 50s and really before. But for the most part, railroads are going to carry something that, that they're going to carry finished automobiles, and they have a very high percentage because they do it pretty well. But people need to buy finished automobiles for them to carry them. So, we have to watch the economy, the volume trends, which are published weekly in North America. Is a critical part in the short term. We follow their earnings, which get reported every quarter. Many people use that as the be all and end all, and that's one of the big fights is between short term thinking and long term thinking in this industry. The earnings calls that we're about to get in a couple of weeks here, which may be well behind us by the time this is heard. I use them as the way they were originally meant to be used, a snapshot of the strategic plan as it is on this day. And so we get, pull the blanket back and look at the sheets a little bit more here. And so what I really try to do is look at how is the strategy playing out? How are the influences of the ownership, i.e. the shareholders, impacting the railroads and the managements? How is this battle between the cost-driven and growth-driven focus, between a short-term and a long-term outlook? How is that playing out? How should it play out, et cetera? So I look to see what the strategies are of the managements, and then how that's playing out in the the real day-to-day. That's what I try to do with this. But in the quickest thing to say when people say, well, what do you think? How do you look at the railroads? How is the economy doing? We have gone through an amazingly volatile 5 to 7 years for an industry that's usually pretty stable, right? With this broad commodity mix, something's up, something's down, and they usually grow a couple of percentage points. But we've seen, too much of a short-term focus on cost cutting, which has led to a degradation, which I think has been recovered from, in service, which led to some share loss. We saw the trade wars, which we may be getting back into, depending upon the election in November, which were incredibly damaging to the economy and to people that serve the economy, like transportation companies. We saw the pandemic being the biggest thing that's happened, in 100 years, maybe to everybody, but to the railroads was incredibly, important event. The economy just stopped for a few months, and then it started up so quickly it was hard for railroads to react. You saw the regularly scheduled national round of labor negotiations. Railroads are highly unionized. They typically meet every 3 years. It was every 4 years because of COVID. And with now the advent of social media became a front page rather than business page issue. And you saw a major incident in East Palestine, Ohio, with a derailment. Railroads are by far the safest mode of freight transportation. But when you talk about airplane crashes, and not to make it's a terrible comparison, but if a big plane goes down, everybody notices it. But if you think about it in the fullness, air transportation is actually very safe. If when a railroad train derails, a lot of cars, are there. A helicopter flies over and sees the logo on the locomotive, and it becomes a big issue. East Palestine ended up costing Norfolk Southern well over $1 billion. It became national news, congressional hearings that were really disgusting, in my personal opinion. And just want to remind everybody that there was not a single injury. So the days of sort of the business pages being read only by business people and that thing being is all changed with social media. So railroads have gone from political impacts of the Mexican elections and what's government in Mexico, because that's a huge market, our trade policy, the strength of the dollar, a major accident in an incredibly safe industry that garnered a lot of publicity, labor negotiations, the stopping and then restarting of the economy, which is unprecedented. If you think about the pandemic, it's still like a rock in the pond. We're still seeing ripples. We just don't remember the initial rock as much anymore. But so anyway, yeah, when I try to look beyond short-term trends as to what is really the long-term thing. What are the railroads really doing? What will they do when the economy does recover? And that sort of thing I do.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or rail car project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, rail car, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. Let's look at one of those long-term trends that's been going on for the past several years and seems to be continuing to be a major topic of conversation: precision scheduled railroading. How has that changed the landscape of the business from your perspective? And do you believe that it will continue to play a major role going forward?
Well, the first thing is the phrase has become pretty toxic, certainly to labor, to Congress, and to many shippers, and it's unfortunate. It's been misused. It's misunderstood. The two Canadian railroads, and I follow the North American landscape, are considered the two of the highest service, maybe the highest service railroads out there. And they both, not only the Canadian National, basically start precision scheduled railroading and spread the gospel to its arch rival Canadian Pacific, now called CPKC. But those operating people are now heading Union Pacific, the head of operations of both Norfolk Southern and CSX. So the gospel of PSR is everywhere. It's in the DNA. The problem is it has been construed as purely a cost-cutting move, and to some degree, in the late teens, it became the focus on the margin, or we call it the operating ratio, the inverse. It is something the operating ratio should improve as you undergo a PSR transformation, but the speed at which it was done at CSX by the first architect of it, the late Hunter Harrison, was politically challenging, and it has allowed you still see labor focus on it as a negative, and Congress. PSR at CPKC, their CEO, Keith Creel, considered by most to be the best in the industry and one of the all-time greats. He says it's in their DNA. People nod and say, "Yeah, Keith, you're great," and then they go back and look at an American railroad and say, "PSR, it's the destruction of everything." So PSR itself is actually a terrific thing if done in a measured way that's not too violent, not too rapid. It actually should lead to improved service. Kansas City Southern, now the KC part of CPKC, underwent PSR in 2018 with the idea that they would improve their service because service begets growth. It was a growth focus. However, PSR has been taken by some in the investment community as a positive, and some in the labor, Congress, shipper community as a negative, to be purely about short-term cost cutting and cost control and headcount reduction and lots of things that certain stakeholder groups do not like. And to some degree, it is, as Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw said, The perversion of the idea of PSR was that it was a short-term strategy designed to rapidly improve financial results, if not volume results or labor happiness. That is a perversion of this. The Canadians have done it in a thorough and responsible way, and in so doing, I think they've shown that PSR can be a good thing. It is too late to win the battle of the words, though. PSR has become a toxic phrase. The idea of running a reliable and scheduled railroad, which means that when your train shows up at a waypoint, a terminal, there is a new locomotive for it if necessary. There is a waiting crew that hasn't had to waste time. That you use your assets to the right degree should allow your customers to benefit tremendously. And it should also allow labor to have more of a regular schedule themselves, because that's a big issue. If it's done right, it really helps all the stakeholders. If you focus on just the cost cutting, which is the reputation, then it only helps one stakeholder group, Wall Street, and the investment community. And frankly, there are some in the investment community who are quite happy about that. That is that battle between short term and long term that it led off with.
And when you were leading off, you also mentioned that you see yourself as not just being in a position of analyzing the trends, but also changing the trends.
Well, that's probably overstating it. Trying to influence them. How about that? I'm not changing them. For example, Norfolk Southern initiated a long-term strategy where they said they are not going to focus on quarterly improvements in the operating ratio or the margin as the only thing they're doing. That's the perversion of PSR, that they're going to carry extra costs, including extra people, through a cycle, so that when the cycle turns up, and it hasn't turned up yet, that they will be ready to handle the growth. Typically, railroads do well as things slow down, and when things turn around in the economy, it takes a while to staff up and to resource up. And so service, usually the more volume, the more economic growth, you see a degradation in service. Think of it as it's not a pipe, but think of it as a pipe. You start to stuff the pipe up, and it takes a while to make that pipe bigger. Railroads have great flexibility for the long term, but in the short term, they're tied to the tracks. They're tied to having trained crews. Norfolk Southern said, we're going to do a long-term strategy. We're going to think differently, keep a little bit of extra cost, a little bit of buffer, to use the Union Pacific phrase for the same thing. And we're going to really do well in the upturn and convince customers that we will be there and be reliable, and make a significant change in the way we're viewed by the customer base, and can go back to gaining market share as they did from 95 to 2015, right? It's supposed to lose share as they've done from 2016 to the present. And so that was a terrific, I think, and very brave thing to do. Move people off what I call the cult of the operating ratio, the focus on having to have significant improvement year over year, every quarter, which can only really be done through cost reduction, because you can't count your derived demand business. You can't count on the volumes, on a quarterly basis. Over time, I think you can. So they announced this policy, and two things happen. The first is the continuation of what we're calling a freight recession. This is really a phrase that a lot of people use, but maybe was made famous by known railroad partner J.B. Hunt. We've had a excess trucking capacity and very weak trucking rates since basically Thanksgiving of 2022. It's the longest freight recession, and this itself is a hangover of the freight buildup and the inventory stocking that came after the pandemic, when everybody was buying Pelotons and whatnot. So after they overstuffed the inventory, things went the other direction, and that hasn't turned back around. So you're doing a long-term strategy, and you're starting not on level ground, but maybe a foot underwater because of the macro environment. Then you have the East Palestine accident, or incident, I really want to call it, which took an inordinate amount of management time, and took down the reputation of the company unfairly, in my opinion, and the industry equally unfairly. But they had to deal with crackpots in the Senate taking televised shots at them and whatnot, rather than work on the railroad. And in this time, a short-term investor group called Ancora basically did a proxy fight to change management out and to refocus the company's strategy from growth back to margin, or from the long term back to the short term. That fight was defeated, but my role in that was to call out Ancora for its duplicity, for its, for what this really was about, For example, calling on Norfolk Southern on safety, that incident could have happened to any railroad. The Norfolk Southern had a tremendous safety year last year, despite having this incident where nobody was hurt. That cost them $1 billion in reclamation and reparation, et cetera. Anyway, the point is, my role in that was to advocate a position, not because I'm friends with the CEO who's under fire at Norfolk Southern, but I am friends with his idea, what I call the great experiment, which is to convince shareholders to look at railroads as a long-term story, to try to build data they can look at every quarter that shows that the strategy is intact and improving, even if, this in this quarter that they earned $1 and they earned $1.20 per share last year. Had they cut all the costs, they could have earned $1.17 and only been 3 cents down. But who cares in the long term? It's a recession. We're in a freight recession. We're not in an economic recession. The railroads really have, if not an excuse, in the long term, I would much rather have them a year or a year and a half from now earn $1.80 in the quarter, right? Because they're gaining share, because they kept extra people on, because shippers are giving them more wallet share instead of just inbound. They're actually sharing some of the outbound that used to go entirely to truck. That they're regaining share in areas like paper, brown paper, packaging paper. Those plants were built around the railroad boxcar, but railroads' labor issues and post-pandemic issues and PSR related issues meant that they started giving more and more of that business, even though the plants have openings that are tied to a 50-foot boxcar, right, or a 70 boxcar. They're giving it to truck. So I'd like to see a time in which the railroads earn $1.80, not $1.20 or $1.17, and they do that because they're taking back share or gaining share in areas that they can. That is the long-term goal. I think what Norfolk Southern tried to say, and what I'm trying to say is, if you look through a cycle, the return on the invested capital, and railroads are capital intensive, is better if you have a couple of bad quarters, and by bad, I mean, slightly worse than you could have if you squeezed every penny out that quarter. The return from the managing on a quarterly basis over a cycle, over 3 or 5 years, is significantly lower than the return of managing through a cycle will be. So you look back in 5 years and say, boy, I wish they had done the great experiment. And that's where people like me can have a role as an advocate as well as an analyst.
Where do you see short line railroads fitting into this landscape?
Critical part of this. The biggest growth opportunity, one that Ancora opposed, which was the first sign that I knew they weren't to be taken seriously, is intermodal. And short lines have a very little role in that. That's a great opportunity, directly competing with the highway. But all the other stuff I talked about, paper, for example, chemicals, grain, short lines play a significant role. They actually have a skill set that allows them to switch traffic for customers, 7 days a week plus. They call it 7 plus, meaning 7 days plus. You just give me a call, Bill, you know me. Whereas the class ones, with their much more expensive labor rules, labor costs and rules, work rules, and their focus on, lots of large customers rather than the small one in some region, aren't as good at. They can be, but it's too expensive for them. It really wouldn't work. It works so well to have a short line as sort of the buffer between a customer, especially a customer not in a major, outside of Los Angeles or Chicago, that customer served by a short line who can switch and pre-block and build and hand the class one, say 30 cars that are going pre-blocked from Chicago to Atlanta. I'm making this up here. And then the big railroad could do what it does best, what it is the best in the world at doing, which is running, big trains, long distances. Railroads on time percentages are getting much better as they recover from some of these issues they had, some of which, but not all of which, were self-inflicted. But if you just count terminal to terminal, they're unbelievably good. It's the handlings, where you get this, in short lines do those handlings incredibly efficiently at a really good cost set. They are incredibly well liked by their employees, by their customers, by their communities, and they carry outsized political clout because of that, because there are 600 plus of them. It's more than there are members of Congress. So, everywhere they go, there's somebody that a congressman counts on whose business depends on short lines. All this time when railroads' reputation having gotten better every year from 1980 to 2015, as it began to turn the other way a bit from in the last 7 years or so, I think it's stabilized. Short lines have never stopped being popular, and for good reason. So I think they're going to play a critical role. They grow the carload business faster than the class ones do, which says something about their entrepreneurial spirit. I'm using a lot of cliches here, but in the case of the short lines, they're basically true. And I think more and more, the relationship between class ones and short lines, whether they want to create more or buy them back, I think they're as appreciated now as they ever have been. As all of these railroads turn to pivot to growth, they realize they need partners. Those partners could be intermodal marketing companies and trucking partners like J.B. Hunt, as I mentioned, but they could also be short lines that are serving as that buffer. Of the 600 plus short lines, I'm going to guess roughly 300 are in short line holding companies. That is, companies that own 10 or more, all the way up to Genesee and Wyoming owning well over 100. Those strategies make a lot of sense because you spread your geographic risk, your commodity risk. If you only are a grain short line, and we have a year with weather issues like we might be having this year, that's a problem. But if you own a grain short line and a paper short line and a chemical short line, then you spread that risk. So the short line industry is healthy, politically powerful, because it's so well liked, not just because it has the money. And it's going to be a bigger part next year and the year after that and the year after that. Very excited about short lines.
When we're looking at this idea of healthy growth, something when you're talking railroad growth in general that's captured the headlines, and certainly over the past 5 years, has been these mega mergers or proposed mega mergers, and the most recent being CPKC. Do you see these continuing to be a trend, or do you think that the growth is going to exist in other ways?
So that growth, I think we're having an issue with the way that question is phrased. First of all, I don't think there'll be any other big mergers. That was the last. The STB put out a set of rules out there that makes any future merger, incredibly difficult. You have to prove that not only does it not reduce competition, but enhances it, and that's so nebulous as to make it very difficult. Second of all, there haven't been any mergers prior to this. There were two companies that vied for the Kansas City Southern, CN and CP, which CP won. But there haven't been any other mergers prior to that since this century. That's so. I would argue that the mergers are not how they grew, right? Because I'm talking about the rail industry overall. If you merge two railroads, you're not adding revenues right there. That one company could have doubled its revenues, but the railroad industry revenues were we're still there or flat. However, this merger, unlike all the mergers that really set the stage for the modern rail industry and created the so-called Big Four in the United States, which took place between 94 and 99, those were all about reducing duplicative efforts. They were very painful. They were plans to have them be accretive or be profitable in a year or two, and it took 4 or 5. There was often service meltdowns. The SP merging into the Union Pacific was the biggest example of that. However, those were cost reduction mergers. They set the stage for the industry, for the renaissance, as I called it, for the possible growth pivot we are now. We wouldn't be there without the UP plus SP, now called the Union Pacific, or the BNSF, or the split of Conrail into Norfolk Southern and CSX, or all the railroads that combined to create the modern Canadian National, which bought up a bunch of regionals like BC Rail, Wisconsin Central, etc. The merger of the CPKC was all about 1 + 1 = 3. It was about getting single line service. It was about improving operations into Mexico. It was about offering alternatives to take business off the highway. Whereas the original round of mergers that dominated the late 90s and turn of the century were all about 80% cost cutting mergers. This is 80% of its anticipated value is coming from growth, not just adding two together so the company is bigger, but adding the two together to create a better service. So the new co is 30% bigger than the 1 + 1 or 50% bigger. So I think it's not correct to say mergers drove the growth, as in the way other industries companies can buy growth. I'm a software company and I buy another software thing, and now I've added this division, and so I'm now bigger. That wasn't what they were about in the past, and that's not really what this past one is. And this is the last merger. There will be lots of transactions on the short line and regional side, selling and buying, because, as I said, the short lines are exciting, and because infrastructure funds, about 5 years ago, cottoned on to the idea that short lines are a great piece of infrastructure, that with real stability. So they've all bought, and all those holding companies, for the most part, some are independent, but many are owned by the likes of Macquarie and the big infrastructure funds. But mergers, this merger is about growth because it was about putting together a system that went across Canada, transcontinental, and now it links across Canada into Chicago, Detroit, all the way down to Mexico City, and the opportunities of creating new business out of that. It is critical to change the perception of railroads and the long-term story that I've been arguing about, and countering the cult of the operating ratio. Even though CPKC says PSR is in our DNA and we wouldn't be here without it, and everybody seems to forget that when they hate on PSR. But the point of this merger, if this merger is successful, it's good for the industry. It's good for the industry's reputation. It has also led to a flurry of counter moves by big railroads that feel affected by it. New alliances forming between CN, UP, and Mexico, besides KCS of Mexico. They have a new service called Falcon, a new service between Hunt and BNSF in Mexico. Lots of other moves. CSX joining into the CP to move goods to Mexico. There's been a flurry of excitement of new people getting together, working with short lines, with other class ones, with intermodal marketing companies or trucking companies, with cold storage companies, with shipping lines to growth. So the strategists and the marketing departments have been running nonstop since the merger was announced. They got a new lease on life, a new shot in the arm, if you will. And I think it's exciting.
It sounds like it. So when you're looking at meaningful growth, then what commodities are you seeing that growth in here in 2024?
None. I mean, that's not true. Industrial products, which are a broad range of commodities, from steel and chemicals, are doing pretty well. Automotive continues to do well. The overall growth numbers are up modestly, but that's also against very easy comparisons. It's also hampered by a huge decline in coal, which we know is in a secular decline. Keep in mind, when we look at the struggles of the rail industry over the last 5 or 7 years, after 25 years of forward progress, that they're doing this in the face of their largest commodity historically, their founding commodity, going down the tubes, and that is, utility coal in the United States. So facing that, hill, they've done a pretty darn good job with their volumes compared to that. But this is, so far, we're seeing growth mostly due to comparisons. The biggest opportunity is intermodal, where we've seen both international and now domestic intermodal look good. That is always the lead. If that doesn't lead the industry in growth, then something is very wrong with my whole thesis. The idea that I would expect intermodal to grow at a multiple of GDP, and we want carload or basic manifest business, the Christmas tree train of a boxcar, a tank car, and all that, to grow at something like the level of industrial production. It's trailed that. They've lost share, but they need to restore to that growth level. Coal is going to be in a long-term secular decline. Export coal, which is very good business, remains strong. The housing market is not helped in the near term, so that's impacted lumber and to some degree steel. Trade wars in the future and tariffs could have a huge impact on this. But the basic goal, we're not seeing significant signs of, we're in a freight recession, so it's hard to find those signs of improvement in 24. If you look at the numbers on the weekly basis, they look pretty good. You have to remember we're comparing with the time in which last year was pretty lousy. So we know not to get too excited by the growth numbers we're seeing, but I am excited about the domestic intermodal growth. There's signs that the trucking depression, which impacts intermodal because that's what it competes against, is starting to lift, and that will help the overall market. The consumers remained strong despite this weakish economy. So we have to look long term. 2024 is just going to set up a base year. We haven't had a base year, a normal year to make a comparison to for so long between trade wars and the pandemic and other things going on. It's been really hard to say, this is kind of a normal year. How do you grow from here? What do you do from here? And I think that's the best case we have for 2024 as we look at 2025 and hope to see real secular growth.
When would you say was the last base year that we had?
2016 or 17. You know, you have to remember that the trade wars, in my opinion, completely idiotic, scrambled the volumes in a big way. People pre-bought and moved around, and that was an enormous deal to intermodal, which is 40% of the business, to the rail world. How the fact that that was really the story of 17, 18, and 19. Those were big deals. Completely overwhelmed by what happened in 2020, right? Which we look back and say, oh, that was not. The patterns of trade good movement completely changed because of political events. Then the pandemic just, all bets were off after that.
So my last question for you, Tony, is how would you define a successful long-term story, to use your phrase?
A long-term story allows for, an efficient railroad. So it's, cost cutting is not bad for a company. It means cheaper consumer goods for all of us, but one in which the stakeholders are all involved. There's a virtuous circle where you can get volume growth by providing good service, which means shippers, who are often at loggerheads with railroads, that's a natural frictious relationship, will be, you'll never find a shipper say, God, they're just so good. I just love my railroad buddies, because they're always trying to lower the cost, right? That's their job. But if they won't take it up with their congressmen. So regulators and legislators will feel better. Shippers will feel better. There's more volume, so labor will feel better. They're going to get a new contract. Even though we just finished the last one, that was all changed because of the pandemic. They're going to begin negotiations in November. And shareholders will be better because that growth will be turned into good returns. That's the virtuous circle we're looking for. I've seen it happen. It just never happened continuously. The period in the middle of the first decade of the century, we were seeing really good railroad growth, really good pricing, and a pretty happy overall stakeholder group. I think that is something that can be aspired to and returned to. And I think the managements of all of the railroads out here now have changed, having beaten off the Ancora attack. We have railroads that are all talking a really good game about growth and about, better stakeholder relations. Now they're talking it. You have to talk it before you walk it. But now the proof will be in the pudding. The unfortunate thing is that takes time, and not every investor has got patience. Hence the Ancora proxy fight as an example. But also that we're in a freight recession. If we get through this year in a stable sense, then I think we'll have a very good year next year, and we'll begin to prove out the thesis, the great experiment, that is really good for everybody concerned in this whole circle of freight transportation.
It's going to be good to see how it evolves. Tony, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse today and providing us your perspective on the industry.
Well, I appreciate it, and it will be interesting. Have patience, everybody. Better days are coming.
Sounds good to me.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Scott Becker, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, a place that I personally have a lot of fond holiday memories of as a kid, which led to the question, what is your favorite railroad holiday memory? Here are a few stories that were shared with me via Facebook. First, Matthew Kovacevic says, my favorite railroad holiday memory is undeniably getting to ride on Père Marquette 1225, aka the real Polar Express. It was just so amazing getting to see that engine in person after years of seeing her on video, and I hope to do it again someday. Brian Allen Yostin writes, my favorite holiday memory is of the first time I started out as a fireman. The park I worked for had fireworks on the 4th of July and every other night that year, but the 4th was always special because we were on till midnight. Anyway, we had good pressure, and knowing we were going to make it a slower lap, being the last lap of the night, I kicked back. leaned out the window, and watched the fireworks from the cab. Just me, the steam, and the whine of the generator. Always stuck with me. That's a nifty memory, Brian. And kudos to you for being creative and not limiting yourself to just Christmas. Lastly, Elizabeth Ozrak writes, Gypsy Rose derailing the model trains around the Christmas tree and you putting them back. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Yes, that is my mom, and what she's recalling is our cat Gypsy Rose knocking over, fortunately, either cheap HO scale trains or Lego trains, so they weren't too hard to put back on the track, and I wasn't worried about them becoming damaged. And yes, it could be fun to see how cats interact with model trains. Your question of the day for this episode is, what are you excited for in 2025? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media there. Guys, we are gearing up for another great year. The podcast next month is going to be the 10-year anniversary of the podcast. I'm so excited. It's really great to be able to celebrate that with you guys. Remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.